Why they are
Because first, you know better than me, Apple in the last quarter registered a decrease in sales, and it was the first in I don't know how many years. And this was because sales in China, Apple's sales in China dropped. And Apple and other companies are afraid of IPR theft by Chinese companies. Allegedly, Huawei and Xiaomi and other producers stole a lot of trade secrets from Apple. Apple feels more insecure about China, about security in China, and therefore they see the Chinese market shrinking, and Foxconn, a Taiwanese company which produces physically Apple's, recently has started building a factory in the United States thanks to the help, and they are moving also facilities in India and other countries. So even the technological companies, the ones that build their success on the market, on the Chinese market, on the Chinese stories, are getting scared about the future because they think basically if Chinese government orders Chinese people and Chinese officials to buy Xiaomi, or rather than Huawei, rather than Apple, people will buy Xiaomi phones and not Apple, and therefore they are at the mercy, not of market forces, but of political orders. This is also bringing diversification of industries, interest, and is building on an element that, although you are in economics, I would say perhaps is more in my field, is geopolitics, is my interest, geography, basically. The geography of China. And China has, unlike the United States, which has basically 3 neighbors, Canada, Mexico, and Cuba, China, as we can see here, has 22 neighbors and territories, between countries and territories. The United States has Canada, which is a neighbor, which is not a neighbor, I mean, it's more like a friendly neighbor. Mexico also, is part of the United States. Cuba is the only trouble, but honestly, Cuba is a tiny country and has been a trouble only since Castro took power. China, conversely, has problems, historical problems, with every single neighbor, small or bigger. And this is a huge drag, something that China has been a little bit cavalier about it, because it didn't bother it for a long time, but it started building up since the financial crisis in 2009. Why the financial crisis was the trigger? Because at the time, as you will remember much better than me, there was an issue that the renminbi, which was pegged at the time, although with a crawling peg to the dollar, but it was very much controlled by the central bank, refused to revaluate against all the other currencies which had kept their value against the dollars. So what happened in 2009 is, yes, China helped a lot with the growth and with consumption and with its financial stimulus. But it got paid back by keeping the renminbi low against all the other currencies in the region and in the world which had revaluated. And so it undercut exports from neighbors and other developing countries. So in the 2009, there was a really important political and I would say psychological shift. In 1997-98, when there was the Asian financial crisis, at the time, all currencies in Asia, attacked by speculations coming from Wall Street, were going down. But the renminbi at the time and the Hong Kong dollars, which had returned, Hong Kong had returned to China in July 1st, 97, held fast, didn't devaluate. And by not devaluating, it stopped and stemmed a wave of competitive devaluation, which would have possibly crashed the Asian economy even further. At the time, I remember we just had met with Francesco. There was even floating the idea of floating of an Asian monetary fund, maybe sponsored by Japan and China, because they felt the IMF had been ineffective or counterproductive. The economy of Indonesia, with the rupiah devaluated by 80%. There was social turmoil, political turmoil, and say dictatorships like in the Philippines and Indonesia were brought down by the changes. But the Hong Kong dollars, which actually is a technical, cannot be devaluated against the dollar because there is so much amount of US dollars treasured in the treasury of Hong Kong, so it's really is firmly pegged against the US dollars. Plus investments from China and administrative measures around the renminbi protected the Hong Kong dollars and the renminbi from devaluating. And this gave a sense to the Asian countries that China will think of itself, but will think of us, and China may be better than America, which thinks, oh, these market forces are neutral, but actually there is a conspiracy of Wall Street attacking us, changing our government. 10 years after, however, things have reversed. When China was pressured directly and indirectly by the United States, Obama went in November 2009 to Beijing asking for the revaluation of the renminbi. China refused, turned it down. Why? Because China thought we had to take care of our interests. We already pay so much by buying United States Treasury bonds, debts, imports. We cannot pay even more by cutting our exports and allowing other countries to benefit. So in that moment, starting 2008, 2009, 2010, the situation between China and its neighbors was undermined. And we have a further proof of the shift. In 1999, Zhu Rongji, then Prime Minister of China, had a conference with the Asian countries about the troubling issue of the South China Sea. China basically, this map is politically incorrect because it has two colors with Taiwan and China, and doesn't have what they call the 9 dashed lines, which supports the Chinese claims that it goes down to Brunei and Malaysia and even Singapore and even Indonesia here. So China claims of this stretch of sea. So when in 1999, they had a conference with the neighboring countries, Georgia said, well, the South China Sea, this is something that we will solve it later, at a later stage when we are better off, and now, for the time being, we'll go on with the mutual development, common development. And everybody supported this idea. However, in 2010, early 2010, shortly after Obama's visit to Beijing, the failure, a big failure, in the meeting on climate change in Copenhagen, and the sentencing of on December 25th, Christmas Day, of dissident Liu Xiaobo. In 2010, they had that similar conference. At that time, Vietnam and China and the United States raised the issue of South China Sea. And then Secretary of State Hillary Clinton said this is an international issue. This is about freedom of navigation. This stretch of sea cannot belong to any country. We have to keep it free because 40% of the global trade goes through this part of sea, and there is 70% of all energy supply to Japan, 50% of all food supply to Japan that goes to the sea. So it is an international issue. And that time, all neighbors supported the idea. At the time, they felt they had been wronged by China, and China, again, no matter what is right or wrong, it's just about perception. Perception is important. You may think that I'm ugly, but I'm actually very beautiful. But what is your perception is the right one. At the time, they perceived China cheated us 10 years ago. Yes, China saved us 10 years ago with the financial crisis, but it was just only looking for its own short-term interest. The United States, however, is more adamant, is more clear. We know the United States better, and we can rely on the United States better. So all, starting from the financial crisis, this all underlying friction between China and many neighbors came up again. So there is an economic issue here at stake. This is important because American security and peace was buttressed and held together by the Bretton Woods agreements signed between the United States and England in 1944. And this was a security agreement. It's not only about money, but it was security. And undermining and changing the Bretton Woods agreement in 1973, and with the end of the gold standard, changed also the whole security environment in the world. So one by one, let me go through very briefly the neighboring problems. Russia, we already spoke about Russia. Actually, Russia has no border issues. All the border issues have been solved here. thanks to negotiation that started off in the late 80s and went on in the 90s. So we don't have borders issues. But what we have is a broader issue. Only in this part of China, which is hinging on Russia, on eastern Russia, we have 120 million people. In the whole of Siberia, up to the Urals, we have how many? Less than 20? Up to the Urals. The Urals are here. Huh? And actually, this the population is shrinking because people don't want to live in Siberia and move to Western Russia. But Chinese are eager to go and live to Siberia because they think there are good opportunities. So there is a huge demographic pressure, political pressure we spoke about. There is a pressure on Mongolia. There are 2.5 million Mongols in Mongolia, a territory which was part of China before 1921, and according to the map, the official map, still in Taiwan. Mongolia is part of China. Russia has occupied and taken over about 10% of the Chinese territory, about 2 million square kilometers. Huge. Italy, just to have a rough idea, is about 330,000 square kilometers. So it's a huge, it's 7 times Italy, what has been taken over by Russia and its neighbors. So still lingering problems there. But the big problems are not with Russia. And we saw that actually a possible alliance, a convergence of interests is coming together. The main problems are here, in this area. This area which is claimed also by Taiwan, but the claims by Taiwan in a way corroborates and boosts Chinese claims, because both claim to be part of, officially at least, to be part of China. The main claims are with Vietnam, and the latest, there was a clash between Taiwan and China as late as in 1988. It was so it's pretty late, 10 years after, almost 10 years after the war. There are clashes or claims with Philippines, with Brunei, with Malaysia, and with Indonesia. Lots of problems. Plus, we have competition claims on some rocks or islands, which are the Senkaku or Diaoyutao, which are about this here. And actually, Japan occupies it. China claims, until recently, the United States was neutral about the claim, not taking sides. Recently, it changed its position and basically is siding with Japan. Then there is the problem of Taiwan, which is a huge problem by itself. This problem with Taiwan is about reunification. There was a 92 agreement between then President between Taiwan and China, and the two sides agreed to have different opinions on what different interpretation about one China, but they both recognized there was one China. But this agreement and the interpretation of this agreement has become, over the years, more controversial. There have been pushes, and Taiwanese society is bitterly divided. But there is a problem. There are growing problems there also because Taiwanese feel more pressure about reunification or reuniting with authoritarian China. And there are problems, big problems, of course, with India. Here, briefly, there are three sections of border problems. One section is the most complicated. Is the western section. It's very complicated because there is a contention in three between Pakistan, China, and India, and there is a piece of land which is occupied by China, claimed by India, by both India and Pakistan, but that Pakistan officially leased to China. So the controversy is extremely complicated. And then there is the old problem of this area between Bhutan and Nepal, Tawal, which is in the war, in the 1963 war between China and India, the Chinese occupied and then withdrew from it. So in theory, if Mao Zedong occupied and withdrew from it, it should be clear. But in recent times, things have become more controversial. Last year, there was a problem with building a road near Bhutan, which would give a great logistic advantage to Chinese troops over Indian troops. And in this case, it was with neighboring Bhutan, and again, there is a further complication because there is a defense agreement which basically says India will take care of defense of Bhutan. So Bhutan is independent, but India takes care of Bhutan's defense. So India intervened in this Bhutan controversy. So that is to say, lots of problems. And we forgot about Burma. Burma is a problem in itself because this area is almost a non-state. It's not under the control of central government. There are the Wa, Northern Wa, and which are ethnic Chinese, former nationalist or the Shango national, former communist guerrillas during the 60s, aided and abetted by 100,000 volunteers from China in the 60s. Then in the 70s they became drug traffickers. They started dealing with opium, heroin. More recently, they are some of the biggest manufacturers of ice, methamphetamines. And they have a powerful army, quite independent from both China and Rangoon or Yangon, or Naypyidaw. Now the capital is Naypyidaw. So lots of controversies there. How China can deal with all these problems when it has difficulties with internally and difficulties with the United States. And then my sense is that China in the past decades overlooked a very important element. It took United States and United States goodwill for granted. The one thing that made possible for China to have a good neighboring relations with all these complicated issues still simmering was the goodwill of the United States that served as a kind of lubricant in the political relations and social relations with all these neighbors. If this lubricant goes away, China has to produce its own lubricant. Will it produce it? Will it be able to do it? Will its lubricant be as good as the former lubricant, American lubricant? It should be better, because if it is not better, all these countries will complain and will regret it. Lots of problems. And lots of problems which had been overlooked, in my sense, until June last year. Why June last year? For a year and a half, since the beginning of Trump presidency, America had been pushing very strongly, I would say, to change the framework of its relationship with China. However, China had been inattentive, didn't perceive the danger. It started perceiving the danger in June last year, when then the delegation, the Chinese delegation, came back from United States with a heightened sense of danger. Yes, it is dangerous. It is risky. The Americans will not be happy with a few billions of improved cuts in a surplus, with a few purchase of grain or oranges or whatever. They want a lot more. My sense is that China is still coping with what the United States still want, and still coming to grips with a new situation in which America is not only creating new difficulties, having new difficulties with China. Sorry, creating. This is biased because some Americans will say we are merely reacting to difficulties China is creating. So I have a Chinese bias. It's biased. It is going much further. It's going to Japan, it's going to neighboring countries. We have new intelligence agreements between Japan, Vietnam, and India. We have military cooperation, increased military cooperation in Southeast Asia, all these aimed at China. And this has, of course, economic spin-offs, because, as we saw, the beginning of Chinese growth happened in relations with two wars in which China sided with the United States, Afghan and Vietnam. Now, this new security perception is de facto helping all these other countries to have a better deal, better trade deals than China. Having said that, again, the 89 perspective brings us to reality. Chinese are not warriors, they are businessmen. So if they see tomorrow that really there is no way to carry on with the old ways, that they have to change ways, that they have to change their perspectives, maybe they will change. But and to change the relationship with America would help changing relationship with also the neighbors. But this time, it is different from the past. This time, I think they would have also to engage individually with all these countries, which they have started, in all fairness. They have started. And what is happening is that countries like, starting with Japan, you know, there was this trade agreement which was about to be signed with the Obama administration. Trump, free trade agreement. Trump withdrew from it, and then Japan went in with China alone to discuss a new trade agreement and new investment opportunities, and Japan got very good opportunities for investment in China. So what happens now is that as the United States has not come to a very comprehensive strategy about China, many countries are dealing individually with both China and the United States, selling themselves to the highest bidder. What in Italy we call the policy of the two ovens. You know, you bake a biscuit is cooked twice. Cooked twice, one in one oven, one in another oven. So, but this selling itself to the highest bidder doesn't make things very easy for China, because the price they have to pay to each of these neighbors will be higher and higher. So the position of China will be, even in this case, difficult. But again, China are not warriors, they're businessmen, so they might figure out a way to get out of this predicament.
You've been saying 3 or 4 times now that China supported the US in the Vietnam War.
Yes.
I thought the general agreement was that...
No. In the 79 Vietnam War. In the 1979, there was a border war between China and Vietnam. China invaded Vietnam. What happened at the time is that Vietnam invaded Cambodia to topple the Khmer Rouge regime. And actually the Khmer Rouge were supported by China. But also the Americans were afraid that Vietnam, after Cambodia, could go over Thailand, could push. They had already gained control of Laos, Cambodia, and then it could push into Thailand. So they supported, at the time, a small but pretty violent border war with Vietnam, in which, in a way, Vietnam was checked. So they were afraid that if they pushed any further to Thailand, against Thailand, then China would go to Hanoi, which is just a few kilometers from China. In this sense, China proved it would be an important ally against the Soviet Union. Not only that, in the 70s and the 80s, there was a war in Afghanistan, and they had weapons and training center from Pakistan, and this we know about it. But you should be able to see it. Let me. Oh, here. There is a little border, little tiny border between. Direct border between China and Afghanistan. You see? Yeah. And through these weapons were sent to the Mujahideen, and the Mujahideen were fighting the Soviets. So there were two occasions in which the Chinese supported the United States against the Soviets. And because of this, Chinese obtained from the United States low tariffs for and most important, they were granted the permit to have technological transfers. Technological transfer is very, very important because actually this technological transfer is also the beginning of the IPR theft, because I transfer the technology, but you're not supposed to steal the transfer, but why do you transfer it to me? But in the beginning, in the 80s, it was a gray area. In the 90s, less of a gray area, and definitely after that, it had become a huge problem. But technological transfer is very important, was very important for the whole industrial development of China in the 90s and up to now.
I was asking because we have spoken about this area, but I know also in Africa there is still like, I don't know, there's a huge buying of lands and people going to China. I was in China 2 years ago, there were also a lot of Africans going to in the other way around. So what is going on there? If there is like a major plan or
Africa it would take half an hour to explain. If you want, shall we go to Africa? Yes. Africa is very interesting. Africa is a very interesting example. It's interesting because Africa was instrumental in the growth of capitalism in Western countries. Slavery, since the discovery of America started very early with the Portuguese and then the Spanish bringing slaves in the 16th century to America, and which created surplus, sugar, cotton. Cotton industry was instrumental for the Industrial Revolution in England, etc. So Africa, after slavery, started colonialism. Rather than taking people out of Africa, Western countries went into Africa, occupied the land, extracted benefits, and then even when they pulled out after World War II, they started having cash crops, which created a strange economy in all of Africa. China went in very differently. Of course, at the beginning, they had relations in the 50s with this USSR. USSR is there, we're helping this country. And when there was a split with the USSR in the 1960s, they kept a good relation with Tanzania. They built a railway there. And then when in the 70s, Portugal pulled out from its colony, they had good relation with Mozambique. They helped build, but they were spots, a little help with Egypt, a little help with Algeria, nothing substantial. However, in the mid-90s, something more happened. China needed raw material for its growth. It didn't have money. So what they did, they basically started a model which worked very successfully. We build you infrastructure and you give us raw material. This model has been quite successful for two reasons. One reason is that because, and everybody complains in the West, you give help without strings attached, without checking on human rights and how the money is spent. This money goes into corruption, etc. But the other thing is that they created infrastructure which was badly needed and is badly needed. Now they're starting thinking of a railway going all the way from east and western of Africa, and roads. And now if you think there is no direct flight or direct train that goes from Lagos to Addis, which are huge cities, one on the west and one on the east of Africa, and there should be no real reason why there shouldn't be a railway or fast railway between these two capitals or these two countries, which are huge countries, and the Chinese are building. So they are creating real growth, real wealth there. And in fact, I think part of the reasons of the migration of Africans to Europe is also from the growth produced by investments, Chinese investments in Africa. You see, if you want to cross the Sahara Desert, you need food, water, a car, a guide, everything that is very expensive. And of course, if you want to cross the Mediterranean, this is cheaper. But you have to reach Libya first, which is very expensive. So the migrants are small and medium entrepreneurs from Africa who have little money, or whose family have a little money to pay for the trip, and they invest on these people who are very bold and courageous and entrepreneurial and take this risk on their own, paying. If they had been poor, much poorer, without this investment, they wouldn't have the money to pay for the trips through Sahara. So this investment is creating a new wealth in Africa, which is also corruption, but not only corruption, it's real wealth. Growth in Ethiopia, for instance, which is flushed with Chinese investment, has been about 10% in the past 10 years. It's a real thing, because what they are doing also, apart from creating infrastructure, is delocalization. We have been speaking about delocalization in Europe to China, but actually the new wave is Chinese delocalization to Africa. Factories which are no longer productive because labor cost is going up in China, are being moved to African countries. In some countries, this is creating a vicious circle of corruption. In some cases, like Ethiopia, it is creating real growth. So this is interesting also because African countries, for the first time, they have competition, and competition is good. Now they can go to the Americans, to the Europeans, but they can go also to the Chinese. Strings are different, conditions are different, but competition overall is good. So I would say it is definitely very positive. However, from the security point of view, which I feel more confident about talking than economics, there is a huge baggage for China. Trade between Africa and China is at the moment guaranteed by the American fleet. And not only that the Americans have the power to disrupt whatever trade and blockade whatever Chinese trade may happen, but also at the moment they are the ones who provide security against pirates. And there are two, we have two areas of piracy, one on the Horn of Africa, Somalia, but there are also the old Malaysian pirates in this area, because this area is loosely patrolled, so there are lots of there is a lot of piracy over there. And at the moment, the Chinese fleet is not able to guarantee security for its own trade cargo fleet. So the Americans are providing security for the Chinese, are securing these sea lanes. So if Americans were not, to say, willingly, actively disrupting these sea lanes, but only passively, not guaranteeing these sea lanes, China will be hit already. So it is kind of tricky. Yes, please.
So I have to thank you because you completely changed the understanding of the head of China. Because until 2 hours ago, I was sure that China would, I mean, especially with all the investment that you just mentioned in Africa and all this in the world, I was pretty sure that China was somehow ready to challenge US in leading the economic environment, let's say. And now you just talk saying that actually China will have to somehow step back and start negotiating with the other countries and the neighborhood and so on. Is it actually what you're saying?
Yes.
Right.
Yes, I think so. I mean, the Chinese had this perception, and I think they were fed this perception also by us, but there was an unspoken element there. That is, I believe, I mean, this is, the Americans and the West were ready to allow this to happen, provided China abided by the Western rules. At a certain point in this voyage, the Americans and the Westerns are starting realizing it's happening now that China is not willing to abide to Western rules, and then everything has come to a different situation. How it will evolve, we don't know. How it will evolve, we don't know. We still have the possibility that China may get ahead of the game. Because it will change, it will adapt, and it will be the big country. But it needs to adapt. If it doesn't adapt, then there is the other possibility that the world will adapt. In theory, it is a possibility, but, you know, as far as I know, history, China tried this game in 1840, before the Opium War. Said the English and the French, the Western powers, the imperial powers said, let's trade, because what happened is because of tea, basically tea. Porcelain in China was minor, but tea brought to China 70% of the global silver. All the 70% of the global silver, which was the foreign currency of the time, was in China. And the English and the world, the Western world, paid for tea. Because why tea? Because tea made water drinkable. During the Industrial Revolution, water was foul, people had to drink. How can you make it drinkable? You put a few leaves of tree and you make water drinkable. So it's very important commodity. And China had almost a monopoly on tea. Very important. And the American Revolution starting with some Americans pretending to be Indians and dumping trees, dumping tea in the water. You know? And so tea was very, very important at the time. They wanted to trade. China closed on trade. At the time, China was about 1/3 of the world, or half of the world economy, so it was much bigger than now. Now it's less than 20% of the economy. It has 70% of the reserves. Now again, maybe 20% of the global reserves with $3 trillion, far away from that. And we know what happened in 1940. Again, a small, tiny military defeat which triggered internal problems that eventually led to the demise of the dynasty. Now China is much weaker. It has this lesson of the past, so it may learn and it will adapt as it didn't adapt then. But to think that it will win this competition and will be able to push its own ideas onto the rest of the world. I'm doubtful, because it didn't manage to do so in 1840, when it was much bigger and stronger. Now, I wonder. But, yes?
I have a question. Everyone talks about the trade war.
What
Trade war.
Trade war, okay.
That Trump started, but the fixed regime of the renminbi works in the same way. Do you think the PBOC will have to devalue the currency in order for Trump to seize the tariff war?
Or reevaluate. The people think that they should reevaluate, not devaluate. Reevaluate. There are people in America saying that, but I think the renminbi is a tiny fraction of the American demands are much bigger than the renminbi. The renminbi was an issue in 2009, the revaluation. Now it is much bigger.
So, go ahead.
Okay, can you just give some idea how the power structure works in China? Like you gave some reflection on, U.S. power structure, how it is driven by the industrial lobby, and pretty much the same in other countries. But China, it's like a closed box. We have one representation. You said about like Xi Jinping, but then how he, what are the things like which happened behind him? And yeah, basically.
China is opaque, and one of the issues is Chinese opacity of political structure and political decision maker. Western countries are less opaque, are more transparent. This doesn't say that it's all transparent, but there is an issue of opacity. It's just like you see better with glasses or without glasses. With glasses, better. Nobody's sure about how the decision-making processes comes through. What we know that in the past 6-7 years, Xi Jinping has concentrated more power on himself and on the Politburo. So he has a lot more power than any of his predecessors since Mao Zedong. Having said that, China is far more complex, and the world is far more complex than China and the world at Mao Zedong's time. So the fact that he has concentrated so much power in his hands makes perhaps things even more cumbersome, because he has to decide on his own on many different things, and he is maybe not briefed well enough, doesn't have, and so things could be complicated. However, Xi Jinping has a lot of power. It doesn't mean that he has all the power, because as we were saying before, he wanted to carry out this reform of state-owned enterprises as early as 2013. He failed, and he's still not able to push it. And there are some people allegedly close to Xi Jinping who say, yeah, maybe this trade reform is good for us, it's good for China, because this push from outside will help us reform the market in the way we wanted, in the way Xi Jinping wanted, and we have been so far unable to perform. So in the end, this could help bring about a better China, a more modern China, and a China more integrated with the world. This could be a positive outcome. But I wanted to give you the negative outcome, because I think with age it comes this gloomy outlook. You better be prepared for the worst, because if you are prepared for the worst, you'll be positively surprised if something good comes up.
And what is the perception of the population in general of Xi Jinping, and on this sort of power that he has, and this continuous power that he will keep on having, since the government has allowed him to continue on the power until he wants to?
I don't have any. I didn't have any opinion polls. You know, I didn't conduct any opinion polls, so I'm not sure. My feeling, gut feelings in the streets, is that people, common people, like Xi Jinping. Officials, rich people are scared of him. Common people like him. Because, say, corruption was a cost on the livelihood of common people. They had to pay the policeman or the official to get the electricity, to get this, to get certain. So, by taking away corruption, he has touched on the lives of many people who pay less for some services. However, if this doesn't change completely the society, if this slows down the economy, then things might, the tide might change. People could feel in danger and risk.
Let me ask you a question, because I had the same impression he had. I go away from this morning with a different view about China. So my economist view is that if I look at countries in the world, there is a level of income per capita. When you reach the level of income per capita, you move to a democracy, or you slowly move to democracy. There is almost no country in the world that has grown beyond a certain level, remaining an autocracy, a dictatorship, and so on. So China is almost there. No? You look at all of Latin America, that's what happened in Latin America in the 70s, 80s. So China is almost there. So my simple view was, this has to happen. Because if you don't do this next step into a more democratic society, you cannot have the benefit of additional growth. No? That's why they do it. It's not because Brazil moved to a democracy because they reached a level beyond which growing implied being a more democratic society. So this is going to, I don't know how it will happen, but it will happen in China. I was looking for signal that this might happen. Now you tell me, forget this. China is never going to change. Wait, let me think. It's never going to turn into a democracy. In fact, as he said, they just appointed a guy who's going to be there for life and maybe his children after he dies. But that's what I learned this morning, that the US is no longer ready to accept this. So my view was, it will take decades maybe for the China to do the transition to democracy, but until that happens, the US will sort of survive with this strange neighbor. Now you tell, no, the US said enough. You have to actually do the transition. This is dangerous. This I never heard. I mean, I thought the transition would be long, but that it would be pushed by the US, I never thought about this.
I mean, this is cartoon-like. I mean, but yes, I said that. Is America pushing for a political change? Officially, nobody said that, but I would say the overall drive is this. And yes, I would say this is the overall direction. Either it goes to become some kind of more democratic, more open society. I wouldn't say democratic because there are different kinds of democracy, different kinds of freedom, etc. But either goes more open, or we are going to some kind of Cold War. This is the alternative, I would say, at the moment. And because Americans are fed up, but I would say also Chinese neighbors are fed up for different reasons. And we don't want to go into very complicated things. People complain about the treatment of Uyghurs in Xinjiang. People complain about democracy and freedom being cut down in Hong Kong, freedom of religions, etc. So there are a lot of issues which are very dangerous Very, very, very.
No, I just wanted to add something because I was traveling to China like 3 years ago, and I was talking to the people there, local people, common people, as you said, and I was asking them, do you want to make this transition to democracy? And they were telling me, no, this is impossible here. Imagine 1.4 billion people go to schools and vote. We are not going to have democracy so far here, and we are okay, and we like it this way. So adding to Francesco was saying, I mean, to make a transition to China to democracy, and at this end, I think it's quite difficult because the common people, they don't believe in that idea at the moment. So that's what I think. So,
I was just wondering, because you mentioned it, that at a certain point this transition happens, and it's somehow seen that you need this transition to reach higher growth in the future, but I didn't exactly understand why democracy is necessary to grow. And if I may add another thing, we had in Germany a politician that died unfortunately two years ago, was the prime minister in Germany in the 70s, and really tied to China, basically the first politician who made a connection to China, I would say. And he said that Western countries tend to say that democracy is the well-functioning system. At least in Germany, our experience with democracy, that the first democracy after 10 years led to the Second World War, and then afterwards we have an experience of right now 50 years, so we don't know how good it works actually still, I would say. What do you think about that?
Yeah, I say something and then I like it. So again, looking at the data, what happens is you find that countries go through, so starting from an economy that is, from a country that is closed from the economic point of view and from the political point of view. So it has no democracy and no economic freedom. Not say Afghanistan, no? Where do you want to start if you want to make it? And that's very interesting. The path is to get economic freedom first and democracy later. And it's a bad example, but you compare Argentina and Chile. Argentina tried the wrong way. Argentina tried democracy first and economic freedom later and collapsed. Why? Because you create democracy, you create a lot of demand for distribution, but there are no goods to be distributed, right? And then you collapse. Chile, in a way that unfortunately was very costly, tried with economic reform in the 70s and stopping any political freedom with Pinochet. And then, once there was a boost to distribute, democracy came and Chile became the richest country in Latin America. So the data tell you that that's the way to do it. But then the other interesting lesson from this data is that if you do it the right way, so economic freedom first and then political freedom, the political freedom adds something. So it's the, when you enter political freedom, growth continues or starts again. So it's not just it's a better society, a society which has something in terms of economics beyond the society that will have political freedom. So that's it. Now, what we learn today is that maybe China is completely different. Maybe it's so big and has such a history that what we learn from other parts doesn't work.
So just to add to that.
Can I say a footnote just to two internal things? I mean, this is away from the economic models, but into China, two things. One internal, one external. Why either democracy or whatever, stagnation, let's call it North Korea. One is internal, we mentioned in the first half, taxation. Now, taxes cover 20% of GDP, which is very low. But you have no security, growing cost of debts, you need more taxes. The Chinese state needs more taxes. And so far, only state-owned companies pay taxes, but state-owned companies are inefficient, will pay a lot of taxes. You need to get private people to pay taxes, private companies to pay taxes. But if they pay taxes, they want to know how you will spend the money. Because if you don't tell them how to spend the money, these guys will stop working. Because it's a social contract that you have. So you need representation if we want taxation. Second thing, China is still a developing country, but it's the second largest economy in the world, or third if you put Europe in the middle. Still is a very, very sizable, and it didn't matter if it was a small country which was opaque and choosing to drink coffee rather than tea, it didn't affect anybody. But if you're a big country and your choices about drinking coffee or tea affect everybody, you want to have your choices about drinking coffee or tea as transparent as those in any other countries. In Europe and America, which are the two other biggest economies. If you are keeping opaque, you are perverting the whole global market. This is a perversion. It's an objective thing. It's not ideological. It's not about being starry-eyed, all democracy, freedom. No, it's you. How do you play cards? I play with my cards open to the fields, and maybe I had one card close to my vest. But you play with all your cards close to your vest. It's unfair. As long as you play with a few pennies, who cares? You're a kid, you grow up, I teach you. But if you're grown up and you are playing millions, sorry, this will bust the whole economy. So internal and external elements bring us to elements that either China will be isolated and isolated itself, like a big North Korea, which is a possibility, or it will become more transparent.
Just to add to this conversation is that I disagree that Chile is richer and that's why it's a better country. I agree that Pinochet built the institutions while Perón didn't in Argentina. So it's a matter of institutions rather than getting richer, because Chile is not a rich country. And
comparing to Latin America, yes. Comparing to Brazil, for sure.
It's the bed of copper. If China stopped consuming copper, Chile is out of the market.
But right now, Chile is richer than Argentina, Brazil, Bolivia, Colombia.
Just for transparency, are you Argentinian or Chilean?
Argentinian, and I lived 7 years in Chile, so I know both countries very well.
No, just for...
But on the other side, let's say, like following the example of Joaquin, I say that if China now do the transition to a good institution, they may have a democracy. That's the point here. Institution rather than other.
Yeah, but the experience is that the ability to create institutions is not unrelated to your level of wealth. And Tehran didn't create institutions because the situation of Argentina in terms of income per capita was very low.
No, sorry. We were one of the richest countries in the world.
In 1960.
He had the legacy of all that money.
I would like to come back to the European area.
I have just a footnote. I have a paper on proving, trying to show exactly this. What is the best sequencing in terms between political freedom and economic freedom.
I am aware that there is a discussion. I already studied that on my school because I'm an economist, but I have to disagree. It's part of the discussion, otherwise it will not be fair.
Yes. Let's say I would like to come back to the European area, because we said at the beginning that now, let's say we have a lot of distractions like Brexit, internal problem in France, in Italy. So it's like the European countries are overlooking the problem. But since we are saying that it's the biggest problem in the world, I think that at the end they will have to start thinking about how to position the European area in this dispute between China and the United States. And I would like to ask you if you think, in my opinion, what I know is that more or less they are the third most important bloc now in the world, but how much do you think they can have an importance in this dispute against China and the US, and how can they influence the final result about
the role of China?
We don't know for sure. Then we go into really, what in English we call nitty-gritty. So we don't know for sure what agreement they will have. And until we don't know what agreement they will have, we don't know what is the impact. So it's very difficult. If we have no tariffs that will hurt, where they will come into effect in 3 months, in 6 months, tariffs for 50 billions, tariffs for 200 billions, 500 billions, all these are possibilities. So we don't know what is the impact. But I think the overall impact is already here. There is a growing coolness around China, and this is beyond the trade agreement or disagreement. Because as we were mentioning, Huawei, there is on the 5G, there is concerns about having Chinese into 5Gs. There are concerns about dealing with China because of the Muslims. There are concerns about dealings with China because of what is happening in Hong Kong and what might happen with Taiwan. So we are already seeing a general cooling down of the environment around China. How it will proceed, I don't know. It depends on what we will have in the next few weeks.
I have a question. It's not macroeconomics, it's more in social politics, so if you want, you cannot answer. But I think you raised, or even the others one you cannot answer. I think you raised a good point on how you manage security in these big cities that are, security and safety, in these big cities that are emerging right now, and it will emerge even more in the future. So since China is probably the pioneer in these big conglomerates of houses and apartments and people that don't know each other, and for this reason they are somehow not bounded to any ethical or social, economical rule. How do we deal with this situation? Because I think that the surveillance is not the way to go.
It is a big problem. It is a big problem. It is a problem I did a little research on for many years. Because what you had is that you had the largest migration in history. You had about 600, 700 million people who moved from the countryside to the cities. And some to small cities, but nevertheless, they moved from small communities, of a few thousand people where everybody knew each other, maybe a small village of 2,000 people, maybe everybody was related, to huge cities. I mean, cities like 30 million people. You go into these apartment blocks with thousands of people, and they change lease every week, and nobody knows one another. You have huge security problems. Huge security problems. I know people who have been kidnapped, disappeared, and nobody knew how and what happened. So these are real problems because nobody knows, and nobody pays attention because. So. Face recognition, yes, is terrible, but how do you cope with these problems, with cities exploding from 8 million to 30 million people? You have to account for 20 million people who don't know one another, and you don't know them, and they can do all kinds of crimes, and you're left alone, and you go to the police, and the police doesn't know what to do. How do they start an investigation? Gigantic problem.
So you would go with the face recognition?
I didn't say that. I mean, I say that facial recognition is an answer to there is an existing problem. And that is an answer reasonable within the Chinese system. However, because the Chinese system is so opaque, then it lends itself to all other kinds of questions. So what you may want also to make it facial recognition, say, in the United States would be also be controversial, but it will be less controversial because you have all kinds of guarantees, believe it or not, in privacy. In China, you don't have even the nominal guarantees on privacy, so it's more worrisome. However, you don't have in the United States the massive migration of 600 million people, I mean, twice the population of the United States, moving from the countryside to the city in one generation, unprecedented in history.
No, I was thinking, since we are thinking about this segregation that we're having between area of influence, I'm wondering which is the next player to absorb the global growth, because now we're thinking about China. However, I think Western countries have exploited China in some way. Now they're not victims.
I don't have any moral values on this. I don't say who is right, who is wrong, because if we go to moral values, we go to the church.
East Korea, India, I don't know that where is like going to partner closely with. Is there any hint on this way? We can also ask them to submit other people here. But what do you think this big country, which is projected to be maybe the third economy in some years?
Yeah, India.
Can I just add that? Because I was going to ask the same question. Because after this gloomy view about China, the obvious solution is that the world is going to move here, right? From the social point of view, from every point of view.
Yeah. Well, my concerns about India are, is a little bigger. A little bigger. The democracy there is not working. There are divides in castes and religions which are huge. And the country, political divisions is also huge. There is now the BJP party, which is trying to build a new national identity, but the Congress, which is the more pro-Russian, is still, and of course headed by the Italian, almost Sonia Gandhi, is still there, is still strong, is pro-Russia, and things in India are easier at first because you have English-speaking people, you have institutions, but then there are lots of difficulties. Traveling in India by plane is more expensive than traveling in and out of India. This doesn't make sense. There are no fast train, railways. There are plans, but the plans are not coming to fruition anytime soon. So India has, I think, to get its act together. And in this sense, I think Modi is right, whereas China, very briefly, China needs more democracy. Perhaps India needs a little bit less democracy, more concentration of power, because bargaining every time between Indian states and bargaining every time between different power groups, people selling hundreds of thousands of votes in Rajasthan. This is not the right way to go.
That's two questions.
I had one question regarding on China or North Korea. Do you think the topic of North Korea plays a role at all, or is that just a marketing stand from the US, trying to say communism is bad?
North Korea is very complicated in itself. It's interesting that the meeting between Xi Jinping and Trump will almost coincide with the possible meeting as dates between Trump and Kim Jong-un. China at first was lukewarm about this helping or not helping this meeting between rapprochement between North Korea and the United States, and now it realizes that by helping a rapprochement, a solution of the North Korean problem, it gains brownie points with the United States in all the other agendas. So it can help starting a virtuous circle. So yes, if there is improvement in North Korea, maybe there is also improvement in with China in the United States, perhaps. But again, these are balls up in the air, and we haven't seen how they will fall.
We don't want to say anything about what he said.
India is complex. It's complex. You know a bit, but then you don't know a lot.
Yeah, like China, yes. Just a skim in the surface. Exactly.
So I have an opinion on, like we always say that we had the, I would say, complex relationship with our neighbors. Like India also have similar problem, same as China. We had complex relationship with China as well. But right now, when it comes to, so there are the political connection are the separate thing, political relation. When it comes to business, so China is the biggest bilateral partner for India. Like almost 80 billion every year business is happening, and the growth is around 40% every year, which is humongous. And there are companies which are Chinese companies investing. One of the biggest investment which is coming, flowing in is from China in India. So I guess it's little more complicated than just if we just look at with the political mirror view.
No, absolutely, very complicated, and I won't go into that because it's a whole different issue. And there is Huawei also, that Huawei is helping build the network. But there are also some Indians, and I'm sure you are far more aware of that, that complain that the Indians get the shorter hand of the stick in their bilateral agreements, and basically they import from China industrial products, but Chinese import from India raw material, and they don't import medicine, which are high standard, as good as many Westerns, and they don't import that industrial products. So there is a lot of complaint. However, relationship is improving, and there are lots of complaints because China is seen as the behind-the-scene helper of Pakistan, and even of Bangladesh pulling out, China is investing more in Bangladesh than in India, and Chinese say, well, we invest more in Bangladesh because Bangladesh is easier and is more willing. So this whole continent here, Bangladesh, almost 400 million people here, in a country 1/3 of Italy. But it's moving very fast, improving very fast, despite being Muslim. So this is against all this, the idea that Muslim countries are not doing well. Bangladesh, Indonesia, also 10% growth. Malaysia. So very interesting dynamics there. Very interesting dynamics.
Good. Thanks for this